this evening's session. So an official welcome to all of you to our program this evening. The Stockbridge Library is very happy to be partnering with Mass Audubon for Autumn's Hues and Highlights. And this is part one in a two-part series. And we are focusing on flora this evening. And we are so lucky to have the very knowledgeable and charming Zach Adams with us tonight to share his knowledge and wisdom and his phenomenal photography as well. So without further ado, Zach, I'd love to turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm glad to be here. Nice to see you all. And one important thing to point out too is that tonight's program is funded by the Stockbridge Cultural Council. So big thanks to the Stockbridge Cultural Council for helping bring the programming, tonight's program and next week's program as well. So I'm going to get started with a little introduction about Mass Audubon, and then we'll jump into the talk. Oh, 1 second. There we go. All right, everybody. So Mass Audubon, I'm Zach. I'm a teacher naturalist for Mass Audubon. And so we're a statewide nature conservation organization from Cape Cod and the islands out here to the Berkshires. And we do a whole heck of a lot around protecting nature for Massachusetts. Anywhere from education like you see me doing to different conservation work, including advocacy and land protection and land stewardship as well. So that's kind of what we do, but I like to tell it in a little bit of a story. And we got started over 100 years ago by two women, not the two women here, but two women named Harriet Hemingway and Minna Hall, who saw this, right? They saw people walking around with not just feathers for fashion, but dead birds. There's actually a book about it. It's called She's Wearing a Dead Bird on Her Head. And it's because people were actually using whole birds and feathers for fashion, and thousands and thousands of birds were killed for fashion alone. I think a statistic is, I think it's 6,000 egrets, just egrets were killed in the year 1902 for fashion, just for fashion. So they saw this and they didn't like it. And before women even had the right to vote, they were able to band together and talk to people they knew and start social circles about protecting birds. And so they worked to get some of the first legislation passed about bird protection. And so that's how we got started. And not just the legislation, but they started the first Audubon Society. So the whole Audubon movement across the country began with Harriet Hemingway and Minna Hall. And so from there, it grew a little bit, right? And about 5 years later, after the first Audubon Society was started, the sanctuary system of Mass Audubon was started. And now we have over 100 sanctuaries in Massachusetts, including 6 out here in the Berkshires. 4 of them are open to the public, 2 are not quite yet open to the public, but actually, one will be very shortly. We're putting a parking lot in for our sanctuary in Otis very soon. So that is happening right now. So we grew a lot from there. And with that 100+ sanctuaries, we have close to 40,000 acres protected in Massachusetts as well. So the Mass Audubon, we grew, we changed. We started not just protecting birds, but protecting where they live. And then from there, it grew a little bit more. The sanctuaries weren't just about protecting birds where they live, but protecting birds in migration, right? And the idea that sanctuaries aren't just a place for nesting birds, but important stopover sites for migration. So here's a great example of that. This is Canoe Meadows Wildlife Sanctuary in Pittsfield. And in the photo, maybe you can make out a couple little spots here in the sky. These are birds that are migrating. These are common nighthawks. I'll actually bring them up later tonight, believe it or not, even though we're talking about flora. But common nighthawks migrate in a very short window of time, and they eat a ton of flying ants and insects along the way. And so Canoe Meadows is a super important place for these birds to eat, maybe just for a few minutes, maybe for a few hours, maybe they hang out for a day or two, right? But the reality is they're just here for a short period of time. These birds, most of them are breeding in Canada, and they're heading to as far south as Venezuela. And so where birds are in their migration becomes super important. And that's why these sanctuaries are more than just protecting birds where they live. There's our nighthawk there. And another cool part about Canoe Meadows, it's got the bird in the bottom right, a bobolink. And bobolinks are a bird that most of them spend their winters in Brazil, and they come to Canoe Meadows to nest. So that's a really incredible migration, an incredible way that Canoe Meadows protects these birds. And it's got what we like to say is the best view of any community gardens in the Berkshires on top of the hill. And then we have Pleasant Valley Wildlife Sanctuary in Lenox. This is our largest sanctuary in the Berkshires, hiking all the way up to Lenox Mountain. And we have the other one we have that's open to the public now down in Sheffield, Lime Kiln Farm, a really great walk, usually very empty, few visitors for most of the year, lots of great butterflies and plants. It's a really amazing place to go. Nice and easy trails. The spring wildflowers are really incredible as well. And one of our newer sanctuaries, this is just a small, actually, it's just a little pull off on the side of the road. This is a heron rookery. This is Tracy Brook Wildlife Sanctuary. This beaver pond has a massive, massive beaver dam on it that is at least 30 years old and has something like 17 or 18 great blue heron nests on the pond. I just saw a question in the chat. Some people still do call Pleasant Valley the bird sanctuary. When I've actually when I started the job, a lot of people I met said, "Oh, you work at the bird sanctuary," and I didn't know what that meant because I didn't grow up in the area, so I didn't know what that meant till later on. But yeah, I hear that quite a bit. So like I said, the beavers and herons here at Tracy Brook are something to see. But we also do a lot of education programs. So this is where I come in. We do anything from summer camp to in-school education. For the winter and the school months, I'm in school with students or on Zoom with students, and we do after school as well. In the summer, we have a packed summer camp. Even the last 2 years during COVID, we were gratefully able to run summer camp. And the other thing that we do is programs at our sanctuaries, adult programs, public programs, or canoe trips and bird watching events, and programs like we have tonight. Here's a little map of our school programming. These numbers are always growing. And so our latest numbers are about 1,500 students a year that we reach in Berkshire County. Our goal is always to get to all the school districts in Berkshire County, which there's 15. So at 11, we're pretty close. And then there's other ways too that not just we're involved, but other people can get involved. And that's citizen science and some of the research we do. And one of those projects has been mapping where this species of turtle, the wood turtle, goes on our properties. Some other things we do, we map what bobolink populations look like and salamanders in our forest. So that's one way that we get involved with the science, and ways that volunteers can get involved as well. So with that, I'm going to stop that little presentation and let's get into the main presentation. All right. So tonight we're going to get into the flora, right? All the beautiful fall colors and what's going on in the plant life in the fall. So here's kind of my overview for the next 2 weeks. So tonight we're going to get into, what are we seeing in the landscape? What is actually happening in the landscape? Maybe more of a, hard science chemistry level, and why it's happening. What are the ecological things going on? And then a little bit more of how to explore the fall, how to get the most of it. Next week, we'll get a little bit more into animals with fauna. Now, it's tough to say just fauna, because, as if you've seen me talk before, I can talk about birds for 16 days straight. So I'm going to try to talk about birds and mammals and a few other things along the way next week. So let's start first with, how do we know that it's autumn? What are the signs that it's autumn? Well, there's some social things going on, right? Pumpkins are everywhere, right? We have pumpkin drinks, we have pumpkin spice, we have pumpkin pies, we've got pumpkins as decorations, and then the color orange is used everywhere. So it's kind of like that, it becomes such a part of society, autumn, right? All these beautiful colors, the warm colors of fall, people start dressing in those colors. So you can see it happening in people just as much as you can in the landscape. Maybe you notice birds moving in the fall, right? And then maybe you notice the trees. So as you know, the title and the first image probably make you guess, we're going to talk a lot about trees, because that's what really a big part of what we're noticing, but we'll get into a few other things as well. So if you look at the landscape or this picture, what do you see, right? And this is a rhetorical question, so you can just think to yourself on this one. Or if people want to type things into the chat along the way, I'm happy to see stuff in the chat. But maybe what colors do you see? What trees do you notice? Right? Can you notice specific trees in the landscape or types of trees? Or are we seeing all of the same color? Are all of the yellows the same yellow? Right? What do you see? And if you don't want to type that in, don't feel free, you don't have to. I've got plenty more rhetorical questions here. But not only what do you see, but and this is one I'd love if people want to share with me, this would be great. But what colors do you look forward to in the fall? What are your favorite tree colors, right? What are those colors you're like, oh, I can't wait till that tree starts to change? What are those colors you look forward to? Bright red. Yeah. Bright red is a really good one, right? In this photo, you get a little red, more pinkish colors, but red's one that, people really like to see. I was chatting with, I guess it was a few falls ago, I was doing a canoe trip with a couple from Wales, and they came here for the foliage, and they said, we have some oranges and yellows, but we don't have those beautiful deep reds. So our reds are really spectacular. I like the reds as well. I'm also a big yellow fan. Yeah, I see. Wendy says the leaves that have the mix of colors as well. I did a walk last week, and there was a young child. She must have been about 5 or 6, and she'd pick up different leaves, and they had so many different colors. It'd be red with yellow veins and greens and browns. So that's a lot of fun as well. And then in the fall as well, in autumn, sometimes we're seeing trees that hold their leaves. Maybe in late autumn, when we think all the leaves are gone, we still see some leaves on the trees. And maybe those leaves hang on the trees for much longer than autumn as well. Right? So we can see that happening. We notice when that's happening. We can kind of map autumn along the way. Sometimes we're seeing plants that are fading away. Maybe it's corn in the field. Maybe it's the goldenrod or the grasses that kind of fade away into mottled browns and break down into the earth. So a lot of plants are in that process of decomposing and breaking down, right? So we're seeing that happen as well, just kind of a slow fade of plants, maybe not colors and foliage, but maybe a slow fade, right? And when you think about it, does it all happen at once? Does the whole landscape turn orange? Do they all all the trees lose their leaves at the same time? Do they all turn colors at the same time? What's happening here, right? Does it all happen at once? These are kind of again, a lot of rhetorical questions here, because with autumn, we can watch a lot of this happening. We don't have to even leave our home. Sometimes we can just see it happening out our windows or driving on the road. So we can see a lot of this happening. And kind of there's so many questions that come up, like I just asked, right? But there's so many questions that come up. Is it going to be a good year for foliage, right? Why is it a bad year? Why is it a really good year, right? What are the rules of fall? Are there any rules of fall? And I thought to myself about this as well. And then I finally came up with an answer. And instead of rules, I like to say there's patterns, right? There's no rules, there's just guidelines, because anything I say tonight can have variation. Any trees we talk about with colors, any patterns can have variation. They're patterns. They're not necessarily replications from year to year. So we're always going to see things a little bit different. Wendy's comment about the leaves that have multiple colors in them, it is really interesting, because if you look at a leaf, you can see reds and yellows and oranges, but it doesn't mean that the whole tree is going to turn red, yellow, and orange, or that's going to turn any one of those colors, right? And so there's always a little bit of variation there. So just some guidelines, right? But one thing I want to stress here is think about what the end goal is, right? What's that? Where's fall going? Why are the trees doing this? What is the end of fall? What marks that end of fall? And I sort of said this, but it is a season for a reason, right? It's a season. It's not just one event. It's over a period of time. So autumn, fall is not just this peak, maybe 1 week of foliage, right? It's going to be this whole event taking place, maybe one tree at a time, one leaf, right? And so you can capture parts of fall at different times. You can see it happening at different stages. It's a whole season of it happening, and it all happens at different paces. So let's start with that end part. When does fall end, right? So if we think about this is the end of fall, winter, right? Leaves are gone. Grasses are kind of matted down with snow, right? But the reality is this is why fall happens, right? The leaves start to fall off trees. Trees lose their leaves because they need to. Our deciduous trees, at least up here in the east, need to drop their leaves. In other parts of the world where maybe they don't have a lot of snow or any snow at all, right? Think about the tropics, right? The trees don't need to drop their leaves. They can keep those leaves all year round. In the South, there's an oak species called the live oak. And, part of the reason why it was given its name is because it keeps its leaves all year round, right? But it's not just for the leaves, right? But also because the trees have to go dormant, right? They have to store energy for the next year, where they make seeds, right? Where they have this huge production. They have to grow leaves, grow seeds, grow fruit, and then drop their leaves again. So they need to go dormant. And for some seeds, they need a freeze. They need to be cold for a period of time. It's why if you eat an apple, take the seeds out and try to put them in water to grow them, most of the time they won't germinate because they need a cold spell. They need a freeze spell even. You have to put them in your freezer for at least a month for them to propagate correctly. Right? But it's super important that trees lose their leaves as well, because our deciduous trees are what people say often hardwoods, although not every deciduous tree has super hard wood, but generally our deciduous trees have denser wood. And so they are less flexible. So when the leaves are on the trees and we get a really early snow, that's more weight on the trees because those leaves have more surface area, holding more snow, putting more stress on the tree. Right? And we can see here, right? Some leaves do keep some trees do keep some of these leaves, but the more they keep, right? And the earlier in the year, the more likely a snow is to break down the tree, break a limb, break the trunk, split the trunk. And so it's dangerous for trees to keep a lot of leaves. And so that's why they're losing them, to get rid of that, that's a really important part of losing them, to get rid of the possibility of breaking. But some trees do keep some of their leaves. I saw that in the chat as well, that oak leaves, right? The dark oak leaves that hang onto the tree for the winter. There's a really good Robert Frost poem that I'm I don't want to try to quote right now while I'm in a leaf mind frame, but he talks about the oak leaves on the snow and on the trees that are still left over. And this is a type of oak from the west that's holding the leaves. But notice it's not all of the leaves, right? They don't keep that whole canopy of leaves for the winter. They keep a few. And so that kind of protects them from getting a lot of that big snow damage. Now, conifers are the opposite. What we think of maybe are evergreen trees. They're not necessarily changing. They don't have to drop their needles. So this is the big difference between its deciduous and coniferous trees. The conifers have really much more flexible branches. They generally grow faster, so the wood is a little less dense. And so their branches tend to be much more flexible. They can bend with the weight of the snow. And some of them, it's really cool to watch if you're in a conifer forest and right after a snow, those branches bend way down, they droop. And then as the snow starts to melt, they even fling back up, releasing all of the snow. So often conifers don't hold all of that snow throughout the winter because they're shedding a lot of it. And it's kind of beautiful to see as well. You see those nice pillowy puffs of snow on the of the conifers as well. But they're able, like I said, they're able to get through the winter because they have so much more flexible branches. But at the same time, some conifers do lose their needles. Here's one thing to think about. What's going on here, right? We don't think of conifers as fall foliage. We don't think of them losing their needles because I just said they don't, right? But what's happening here with some of these needles, right? You see the yellow needles, and one reality is a couple times a year, conifers are shedding their needles, just like we shed skin or mammals shed hair, right? They're releasing some of the lower quality, the dead needles to grow new ones, right? So they're doing kind of a yearly shed. So they don't necessarily change color like our leaves, right? But you will see this photo I put on here from today. I saw this tree today, and those needles they're really bright yellow, so it almost looks like foliage, but it's just part of their shed to kind of lighten up for the winter and get rid of some of those lower quality needles. But there are conifers that do lose their needles as well. These are Eastern tamaracks or larches, and tamaracks, they actually lose all of their needles for the winter. And so you can kind of see here. So all of these trees in the background, except for the vine that's crawling up there, all of those trees are tamaracks. And at some point, they're going to lose all of their needles. And if maybe you notice now, those needles aren't very dark. Like if we go back here to this pine, right? Those deep, dark needles of a pine tree, these are kind of pale. They're beginning to fade. These needles turn bright yellow, and they have kind of a foliage just like our deciduous trees as well. Tamaracks are gorgeous in the landscape when you see these beautiful yellow spiky trees in the distance, and they turn that yellow a little bit later in the season. Here's a close view. You can kind of see how some of these needles are already starting to change, right? Some of these are already a little yellow, just a few here and there. Maybe down over here you see some, maybe over this way you see some are just starting to change as well. So tamaracks are one of those big exceptions. It's not an evergreen, but it is a conifer. Pretty confusing, but it makes sense. So why are trees changing color, right? What's happening? Why do we see these brilliant colors in the landscape in the fall? So if we look at just one leaf, right, maybe we see all that yellow or all that red, but this is a good one where you see the stems are still a little yellow. There's little specks and spots in this leaf here on the left as well. So what's happening? And one second, everybody, I got a train coming. Sorry about that. Well, that's that's two vehicles this evening. First a helicopter, now a train. So what's happening to the leaves? It's kind of a complicated process. It's a multi-step process. The branches of the trees, in order to go dormant, they need to shed the leaves. But if that leaf breaks off, right, there's kind of a hole there, right? Because that leaf was connected to the tree, to the branch. And so what happens, rather than the leaf falling off first, the tree starts to grow an extra layer of cells where that leaf is. So that leaf those cells start to grow where that leaf is connected and essentially cut away the leaf as it heals up the hole where the leaf was. So it's kind of a long process there where the tree is healing the hole where the leaf was while severing the leaf itself. And that's when they're eventually falling. But in that process, the chlorophyll starts to break down in the leaf. Right. And chlorophyll is what creates the green color in leaves and helps with photosynthesis as well. And so the chlorophyll breaks down, but a lot of the other pigments break down slower, so they're left behind. So like I said, it's kind of a multi-step process here. Oh, I got a question here. What's the signal to the tree? Light, temperature? Actually, I saved that one for later, but I'll talk about it a little bit now. It's super complicated, actually, and that's why I saved it for later, because it's not one thing. Trees are changing for multiple reasons. It's not any one thing. It's a lot of things combined. I'll chat about that a little bit more later. So like I said, so these pigments are left behind. And so the reds you're seeing is because the reds break down slower than the chlorophyll. And not every tree produces the same pigments. And that's why certain trees will turn certain colors, because they're not producing all of the same pigments, or maybe not all of the same amounts of that pigment. That's why maybe you have a little bit of yellow in this leaf as well as red. So I know words on here, but this is kind of how it goes here on the left, a good idea of the pigments, the different shades you get and why. These fancy words here on the left side are the different pigments and what they correlate to colors. But again, as the chlorophylls break down, these other colors take longer to break down. But they still break down. That's why when a lot of the leaves end up on the ground, eventually they start to turn brown, because all of those pigments are completely broken down. But not every tree ends up turning completely yellow, or not every tree actually goes through much of a change. Maybe that breakdown happens faster. Like I said, there's so much variation, and it's happening for so many different reasons. I'll talk about examples I have here right in my yard, which seem to not make sense to what other trees are doing as well. Here's a good example too of a tree that doesn't fit the fall foliage category, and it's apples. Can you think of what color an apple turns in the fall? I can't, because they don't. They pretty much don't turn much of a color. They shed their leaves. Those leaves they shed really quickly. Maybe it's because they got a lot of fruit on there. I don't actually really know that answer, why they shed so quickly, but apples don't go through much of a color change. Though the chlorophyll does break down and you end up getting brown apple leaves on the ground or on the tree, but that breakdown happens really quickly. Right? Maybe a lot more of that energy is put into growing apples than the pigments as well. So this is an example of it. Apples don't really go through much of a foliage. Now, again, there's exceptions. Sometimes you can find some crab apples that kind of turn more of a really dark maroon color. And, there's always with apples and crab apples, there's always tons of cultivars. So again, always an opportunity for me to be wrong here, because there's tons of variation. And here's a little bit of that variation too. You can see in this picture, these droopy pointy leaves. There's red and yellow pointy leaves because the pigments are breaking down at different rates. This is sumac, staghorn sumac here. And the sumac generally turns really dark red, more like a deep red. But in this situation, it's really bright. It's yellow and orange rather than deep red. But you can see the difference here. We have yellow and green to orange to a little darker red, but not a really deep red like a lot of sumacs turn. So that variation really is how things are breaking down in the leaf. But again, fall's happening not just for one reason. Each individual tree can be in a different place, right? It is in a different place and can have different circumstances, different environmental impacts, different nutrients, different amounts of water. And so this might be turning yellow for a totally different reason than just the pigments breaking down at different rates, right? It might be farther advanced or less advanced than other sumacs as well. Same thing with red maples. I went for a walk the other day and I found tons of deep red maples and then some yellow. The whole tree was yellow or orange. And that's the variation there, right? The red maybe broke down already, or the yellow is more primary, was produced more in the tree. So that variation is kind of a wobbling process in there. So now I want to get into, and again, I said I would talk in a little bit more about what's going on with, what's triggering this. But here's how to think about how do you get the most of fall foliage, where to look, what to do, which kind of gives away what's happening as well. So I like to say, start at the landscape level. So if you look in this picture, try to see, and I tried this earlier, what colors can you see in the forest here in the near side? Now, it helps if you're not colorblind like me. So everything essentially, all of these trees essentially look like the same shade of orange. So, but feel free, type in the chat, what are some different shades you're seeing here in this picture? Anybody? Ooh, rust. That's a good one. Brown. Yeah. Yellow. So we've got some variation here, right? One way to think about fall foliage is you can almost, you can almost identify what you see in the distance by color, right? Because there are patterns. Like I was saying, there's patterns to what colors certain trees are going to turn. And so if we look in the landscape, we can see these different colors and get a good idea of what trees are in the landscape. Now, if we're looking at oranges and browns and those rusty colors, that's tough. Those are oaks. Our oaks tend to be those rusty oranges and brown. And it's hard enough to identify different oak trees when you're looking at them close up, but in the distance, they overlap a good bit. So maybe some of those oranges and rusty colors are tough, but maybe a bright yellow you can get pretty close to, right? Or maybe some of the conifers in there you can notice, right? You can pick out, that's not, that one's a little easier. So if you look at the landscape level, you can really get a view of what's happening in the forest, right? What trees you have in the forest. And if you're thinking about foliage, looking at the whole mountainside is kind of fun, right? You get that nice image of what's happening around you. So here are my helpful patterns, tips, right? Again, not steadfast rules, right? So the kind of a little bit of a key here. Our oaks tend to be the reds, browns, and oranges, right? They tend to be very earthy, much more earthy colored. Sometimes some oak trees turn only brown, or some of them can be brighter orange or deeper red. Yeah, I'm sure I see in there that, driving to Goshen seems like it was beautiful. I was in Windsor this past weekend, on the little higher elevation, really incredible right now. So our oaks are kind of red and brown and orange. Sugar maples tend to be orange or almost a little rusty orange, burnt orange, but can be yellow as well. Red maples tend to be red, right? But can also be orange and yellow. And yellow, like I said, you can see the mix there. So, but red, if you have a red, red maple's a good way to start thinking about it. Hickories and ashes tend to be really bright yellows, more like a matte yellow, a solid yellow. They tend to not have a ton of variation. Maybe you get a little brown or a little rusty tinge on some of the ash trees, but most of the time they're really bright yellow. Poplars as well, like our aspens, like the quaking aspen here in the photo, or big tooth aspen, or cottonwoods, they tend to be yellows as well. Now, this is where I said, I have an example of this in my yard. I have quaking aspens in my backyard that aren't changing color at all. They're just dropping all of their leaves. And a lot of times the poplars are pretty good at changing all of their leaves at the same time and turning yellow. Poplars in the West is a big sight to see. You have these massive stands. Sometimes they're measured in square kilometers of aspen trees, right? Because the cool thing about aspen trees is that they're all connected. A stand of aspen trees is usually one individual tree. I know that's kind of confusing, but they're all connected at the roots. They're all coming from one tree or the same tree. So they're all essentially one genetic individual. And so they often all change at the same time. But again, the aspens in my yard, they're just losing all their leaves. No colors at all, just losing. So get a little bit of variation in there. But those are my general rules to look for on the landscape. There's more species of trees than I have listed here. So, you can see different colors, right? Willows start to change colors a little bit later, and they're going to change. All these trees are going to change at different paces as well. But this is a helpful kind of starting ground. So now if we look at it again, we can see that here. We can see that not all trees have changed at the same rate, right? You can see that happening on the landscape. One really interesting example, if you look, this is Richmond Pond, by the way. So this is on top of Lenox Mountain from Pleasant Valley. And if you look over here, just on the left side of Richmond Pond, down in the wetland, all of the trees have their leaves gone, right? They've dropped all around the wetland. They've dropped their leaves. What's interesting about wetlands is that often you see these bright red colors really early in the season, sometimes as early as August or September, you start to see that red. People often call them swamp maples. They're actually usually red maples that have just turned really early. Essentially, what's happening is these trees are growing in less than ideal situations. They're growing in wetlands rather than in nice, sturdy soil. So they're kind of stressed, right? They have too much water. So their growth pattern is slower. They're shedding those leaves earlier because they're already kind of stressed, not, like they have a disease stress, but they're just growing in less than an ideal situation. And so they often turn super early in the year, like I said, September or August, and have that deep red color. People love to see this, what they say, the swamp maples in the wetlands. So again, nothing is always happening at the same pace. Here's another example of that. Looking at the landscape level, you can make out a lot of different shades here. And this is where the shades aren't very helpful because it's kind of this all orangey reddish mix. And this is actually on top of October Mountain State Forest on Buckley Dunn Lake. And a lot of these trees are red and sugar maple, and those colors are overlapping even, right? But you can pick out maybe a bright yellow in there. Maybe you can pick out, here's one that I like. This tree here hasn't started to turn colors yet, right? This, what looks like maybe a birch here in the distance, hasn't really changed colors, while all of those maples have changed already. Now, this is a fun one where you can make out different tree species a little bit better. The bright yellows on the hillside are the birches, right? And then you can see some oranges actually more of a deeper orange, not a pale yellow, but more of these deeper oranges, and those are sugar maples. Now, it helps that in this part of the world, this is in the Adirondacks, that there's not too high of a diversity of deciduous trees because there's more conifers. And so the birches are kind of a giveaway. You can see that bright white bark with the yellow treetops, and a good portion of the trees are sugar maples as well. So you can see the sugar maples and the bright yellow birches, or the bright yellow leaves from the white birches. So once you start looking at that broader scale, looking at that landscape level, then narrow a little bit. I like to maybe get a little closer and look at individual trees. Again, where an individual tree is growing can impact how it changes colors, or maybe sometimes when it's changing color. And on top of that, that's kind of a fun, maybe a fun aesthetic view of the fall. That's what I like to share when talking about this stuff, is what do I like to see in the fall? And it's these solo trees out in the middle of the field. If you can see on the hedgerow there, some of those trees are kind of yellowy and orange, but this big oak in the middle of the field hasn't changed a color at all yet. I think that's kind of spectacular. So like I said, when you start to narrow, you start to maybe get a little bit more detail. Again, maybe look at the individual tree. On the left, there's a bright birch tree. That yellow, that individual tree, we can make out that that's not a yellow color that we were seeing in any of those other photos, right? That is a birch, right? A white birch that has those bright yellow leaves. It's even reflecting yellow into the pond. Right? And on the right here, right? Maybe we didn't narrow to the individual tree, but maybe a smaller area where you can see, rather than maybe a whole hillside, you can see the canopy is yellow and a little tinge of green. And I always, what I like to say is, in the fall, when I'm looking for fall foliage, kind of like in both of these photos here, I like a mix of the conifers. If you look, on the right side of the road here on the right, there's actually a big stand of spruce trees making it really dark. And on the left, there's a bunch of hemlocks behind this bright birch. And so it has a nice contrast there. Here's another thing I like to do in the fall, right? When I said narrow a little bit, right? I'm not looking outside of the forest, I'm looking inside of the forest, right? That light that we're getting in the forest in the fall, coming through the different colored leaves, is incredible. It's an incredible time to be in the forest. So go for a walk, see this stuff. And I love to see how it's happening and interacting with the water as well. And so sometimes it even makes the water look a little yellow because all those yellow leaves are coming down. But not just that, right? So we moved from landscape to in the forest to maybe on the ground, right? What are you seeing on the ground? The colors on the ground are magnificent as well. And this is kind of one of my favorite parts, is where you get to pick up the leaves on the ground and you say, where did this tree come from? Because from a landscape level, from a distance, you're not seeing maybe every tree in the forest. You're definitely not seeing every individual tree. So I love when you look closer and you can start to see you have a bigger diversity of trees than you thought. Right? And if you look closely here, we have lots of red maples in the water here, but also a few other leaves, some birches and some beeches. Right. So you get an idea of what trees are out there, and then you get to see some of that color in more detail, right? That color close up, the deep reds, the paler reds, the oranges, the yellow. And so focusing in is going to give you a total different experience as well. One more here. I really like to, later in the season, when it's late fall, we're not looking at a whole bunch of leaves changing color. Maybe all the leaves on the ground really started to fade away and those pigments are gone, but maybe you get just one leaf left over. So I don't know if you can see it here, but I chose this photo because of that single oak leaf on the rock here, and the single orange oak leaf in the water. So eventually get to the point where there's just a little bit of fall foliage left. And that is just as beautiful on the landscape, just poking out a little bit, those little dots of colors. And so we can go, like I said, from the landscape, from the whole forest, from in the forest to roads, to streams, to piles of leaves, to a few leaves hanging on, just one or two. So this is that big question from the beginning, right? How to, I said, how to make the most of the fall and why are things happening, but it's all about timing, right? It's all foliage and getting that perfect photo or that perfect view. It's all about timing, and it doesn't always happen at the same time. So here I have kind of three different stages of autumn. Over the left, it's really early autumn, hardly even autumn, still really green, but the leaves have changed to a really pale green. And that's a beautiful time of year, right? You can catch that, just the chlorophyll just starting to break down. Or maybe where just some of the early trees start to change, like some of those birches change really early when most of the leaves haven't even thought of changing. All right. And on the right, maybe you get more of a complete picture, but still it's up to timing, because if you look at the photo on the right, you have bright colors down below, but towards the top of the mountain, the foliage is past, right? So even here, you can see the elevation gradient, right? You can see how it's peak at different stages. And so it's all about the timing, right? It's all happening. Remember, I said it's a season. There's a reason it's a season, because it's a whole big process. But sometimes you catch it like this, that peak where it seems like every single leaf has changed colors. And that's tough to predict. Some places it's maybe a little easier to predict. This is actually near Stowe, Vermont, where all of these trees that we're seeing here are sugar maples. And this whole section of forest is sugar maple. And so it's a whole smooth, continuous forest. So a lot of those trees are essentially having the same environmental, same time of year impacts all at the same time. So you get this big solid change. And in this place, it tends to be pretty reasonable every year. You get a really good foliage, but not necessarily every year, right? But a lot of times you get this nice matchup. But again, here are the things that can impact foliage, right? Precipitation, and not just precipitation now, but precipitation early in the year. If we think about the year we've had, right? We've had unbelievable amounts of rain. And so that likely had a really big impact on the foliage. And one thing I noticed, it seems like all of the trees, it seems like our peak foliage may be a little bit earlier than I was expecting. Maybe not. Maybe that's just in my head. But that rain definitely had an impact. Rain in the moment also has an impact as well, or ice, right? Or wind, right? Those things that can remove leaves before they've even changed colors. Sometimes that happens in the fall, where leaves are just gone from the trees before we're getting peak change, before a lot of those leaves are overlapping with color at the same time. But then the other things going on are day length, right? And temperatures. But not just air temperatures, but soil temperatures as well. So we might have a really cold day here or there, but it doesn't mean that the soil temperatures are changing quite as much, right? And so soil temperature and air temperature are both having impacts. And like I mentioned earlier, where the trees are growing, what conditions, less ideal conditions tend to mean that plants start to change colors a little earlier. Now, I know I've talked a lot about trees, but let's think about a few other things that change color plant-wise, or I should say non-animal-wise in the fall, all right? And here's kind of a little list here of different things to look for. Virginia creeper and poison ivy turn brilliant red in the fall, really something spectacular to look for, but they turn really early and they're gone pretty quickly. Sumac also turns that dark red. Goldenrod, not a tree here, right? and they start to flower in the fall. So do asters. Often, too, some of our non-native plants tend to be pretty significant in the fall, like burning bush, called burning bush because of the beautiful burning colors it turns, pinks and reds, and Japanese barberry, which has a deep Merlot color in the fall. And even things like Phragmite or common reed that have kind of a purplish tinge to their seed heads in the later part of the year. But there's things other than plants and other than leaves that change color as well. So here are a couple of examples of that. We've got the burning bush down on the bottom right, some goldenrod here in the middle where the leaves are actually turning burgundy, and over on the left, some of that nice red Virginia creeper. Here are some of our non-natives. These yellow leaves, this is Eurasian Bittersweet, and Bittersweet has these beautiful golden leaves in the fall. They have golden berries. Actually, the berries have a nice golden husk. They shed that husk to a nice bright red husk. So they have lots of colors going on in the fall. And over here on the right, this is what my yard looks like right now, green. All right, this is a Norway maple. Right, these Norway maples tend to not shed their leaves until November. They don't even turn yellow until later in the year. And so this is kind of a slower process. They're not matched up with our natural processes and our native timing. So often these non-native trees might not fit into the same patterns as our native trees. Here's an example of some of that goldenrod only flowering in the fall. And this is where I start to give hints to you of next week's talk, where we start to get into the animal part, because the reality is it's all connected here. And so even butterflies are impacted by fall weather and the fall colors, and the goldenrod that some of them are moving around to. This is a gray hair streak. But again, we have some non-plant things that are changing colors or bringing colors. Mushrooms go crazy in the fall. September and October are fantastic times of mushrooms. On the right, we have a king bolete with that nice rusty color, kind of a fall foliage. And on the left, that is a hen of the woods. And the hen of the woods is a fall only mushroom. It sprouts in the fall. In fact, I learned about it knowing that it would come out approximately 2 weeks after the first frost. Not necessarily the case, but it's a fall only, and a late fall too, an October, November mushroom. Berries also start to come out in the fall as well. And so we have, these berries are not just coming out, they're ripening. This is when they're ready. They've grown and they've collected sugars, and they've ripened up all summer and early fall. And now fall's a great time for seeing the beautiful colors of berries, some native and some non-native. And they match up, and this is our transition to next week, with animals that use them, right? So this whole idea of phenology, right? The seasons, right? What's happening in the seasons and when, right? There's kind of an order to that, right? It seems like I talked about the whole time about the leaves having little order, but the reality is lots of things are happening, right? And whether the leaves fall in the second week of October, or the leaves change in the second week of October, or the third week of October, they're changing, right? There's a little bit of movement, but it needs to happen, right? So that phenology, that map of what's happening in the landscape and nature throughout the year is really important. These birds love those berries that I just showed. They need that time of year. They need to eat those berries in their migration. This bird gains something like 70% of its body weight just on berries during migration. So that's how important berries being ready in the fall are. But then we have this thing that can go on where maybe things aren't lining up. Maybe resources are not where they're supposed to be. And this is a really big impact of climate change, where maybe the insects aren't hatching at the right time, right? Because temperatures might be different than when, so insects can be really heavily impacted by temperatures. One example is, say, flying ants. So maybe the temperatures aren't pushing the flying ants to hatch in the densities or in the same timing. And so this bird here, the common nighthawk, loves to eat flying ants. So maybe that resource isn't lined up when the common nighthawks know when to migrate, or maybe the berries aren't ready. And so, right, this idea of this trophic, this energy mismatch in the landscape is really something to think about with plants. And when we talk later about how the animals are interacting with those plants as well. So with that, I will take questions, everybody. And next week, we'll get into the animal part.
Zach, thank you so much. That was great. I learned a lot, and your photos are amazing. So it was both beautiful and educational. Thank you.
Thank you.
And like Zach said, we do have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any, you're getting kudos in the chat box.
Thank you.
I think the leaves were later than usual this year. And then all of a sudden last week, they popped. That is up in the higher elevations. They're not so hot down here in Dalton. But up in Windsor and East, they were gorgeous.
Yeah, you know, and that's funny how the difference is like right where I'm at in Lennoxdale. I thought I was seeing some more brilliant colors earlier, but driving to Windsor from where I'm at, right, I noticed that Dalton and Pittsfield isn't necessarily at the same place. So even on a small scale, that's different, right?
We're cooler in Dalton than Pittsfield is.
Do I have a favorite spot for leaf peeping? Well, I will say Windsor definitely has now become my favorite spot because I did a walk last week in Windsor and I was just like, wow, this is incredible. It was really spectacular. And October Mountain State Forest right now is really lovely as well. I like to be in the forest too. I like to have the orange around me.
Yeah, I like that too, especially when the leaves are falling. If no one has any more questions, Zach, I know you have a 7 o'clock deadline, so I want to make sure you get to that. Thank you very much. I look forward to next week's session and learning more about autumn and the animals and the ways they change. So have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. See you all next week.
Great. Good night.
Good night.